Somewhere in the high desert of the American Southwest, carved into canyon walls and scattered across 1,000 square miles of sandstone, there are buildings that have stood empty for 800 years. Perfect masonry, 5 stories tall, aligned with the stars, and completely abandoned. The textbooks will tell you a civilization vanished here. A peaceful farming people who built one of the most sophisticated cultures in pre-Columbian North America, then simply disappeared around 1200 AD. For a century and a half, that was the story, a mystery with no ending. Then ancient DNA was extracted from the bones they left behind, and almost every part of the textbook story fell apart. The peaceful farmers were not who we were told. The collapse was not what we were told. And more unsettling than that, they never actually vanished. What the DNA revealed is stranger than disappearance, and it has been hiding in plain sight the entire time. To understand what the DNA overturned, you have to first understand what the DNA was overturning. And that means going back to a civilization that for nearly 3 centuries was the most sophisticated thing happening north of Mexico. Chaco Canyon sits in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, a shallow cut of sandstone about 9 miles long, surrounded by nothing. No river of any consequence, no fertile valley, no obvious reason looking at it today why anyone would build anything there at all. And yet, between roughly 900 AD and 1150 AD, it became the political, religious, and architectural center of a civilization that stretched across 90,000 square miles, an area larger than Ireland. They built great houses, more than 150 of them. Massive stone structures rising up to 5 stories, some containing over 600 rooms, constructed with a standard of masonry that modern builders still find difficult to replicate. The walls were engineered with interior rubble cores faced in precisely cut sandstone veneer. The rooms were aligned to track the movements of the sun and moon across decades-long cycles, and they connected it all. A network of roads, some of them 30 feet wide, ran in perfectly straight lines across the canyon country for hundreds of miles. At the center of every great house sat the kiva, the sunken ceremonial chamber where whatever held this civilization together was reinforced generation after generation. And then around 1200 AD, it ended. Not gradually, not slowly. The great houses were abandoned within a few generations. The roads fell silent. The population that had built one of the most ambitious construction projects in prehistoric North America simply walked away and left it all standing. The answer that settled into textbooks across the 20th century was reassuring. A peaceful, egalitarian, nearly utopian farming people who worshipped the sun and the corn, lived in harmony with the land, and for reasons unknown, faded into the wider desert. They were given a name, borrowed from the Navajo language, Anasazi, a word now understood to carry uncomfortable connotations, which is why many archaeologists today prefer ancestral Puebloan. The problem is that nearly every part of that story was built before anyone could read the bones. The textbook Anasazi was constructed from pottery, architecture, and a great deal of wishful thinking. When the genetic evidence finally arrived, it did not gently revise the textbook version. It dismantled it. Ancient DNA analysis is exactly what it sounds like. Scientists extract genetic material from skeletal remains that have been in the ground for hundreds or thousands of years, sequence it against modern genomes, and build a detailed biological portrait of who those people were, where they came from, and how they are related to the populations still living today. It is in every meaningful sense a time machine made of bone. For most of the 20th century, this was not possible. The technology did not exist. Archaeologists studied the Anasazi with pottery fragments, architectural analysis, and the oral traditions of descendant communities when those communities were consulted at all. The bones themselves, the actual biological record of who these people were, sat in museum drawers largely unread. Then in the 2010s, ancient DNA sequencing reached a level of precision that allowed researchers to extract readable genetic material from Chacoan skeletal remains. And the first study to do this at Pueblo Bonito, the grandest great house in the canyon, produced a finding that should have ended the egalitarian narrative on its own. The individuals buried in room 33, one of the most elite crypt chambers in Pueblo Bonito, were not a random cross-section of the Chacoan population. They were related closely through the female line across 9 generations. This was a matrilineal dynasty, a ruling lineage that had buried its dead in the same chamber in the same great house for more than 300 years. Reed mats, turquoise by the thousands of pieces, conch shell trumpets from the Pacific coast. These were not the graves of equal citizens in a democratic farming community. These were the tombs of a hereditary elite. The textbooks had described a people without kings. The DNA described a dynasty. That alone was enough to force a rewrite of the standard narrative. But it was the second finding that genuinely unsettled the field. When researchers compared the broader Chacoan genetic profile to the surrounding populations of the ancient Southwest, something did not align. The ancestral Puebloans of the wider region shared a clear, consistent genetic signature stretching back thousands of years. But at Chaco itself, and particularly among the elite burials, there were additional signals. Signals that did not match the surrounding populations. Signals that appeared to have entered the Chacoan gene pool from somewhere outside the Southwest. Something, or more accurately, someone, had come in from elsewhere. And whoever it was had made it directly into the ruling lineage. The DNA could point in a direction, but it could not deliver the source alone. Ancient genetic signals can tell you that a population is an outlier. They can tell you that the outlier points toward a particular region on the map. But to confirm the source, you need more than genetics. You need architecture. You need artifacts. You need the small cultural fingerprints that travel with human beings when they move from one place to another. The researchers looked south. The trade goods at Chaco had been hinting at the answer for decades. Macaw feathers from tropical Mexico, copper bells from the Mesoamerican metallurgy tradition, cacao residue identified by biochemical analysis of ceramic fragments, a plant that grows only in the lowland tropics more than 1,000 miles to the south. The genetic trail and the material trail agreed. The signal was pointing toward the Valley of Mexico. The Valley of Mexico in the 9th century was a world in transition. The great classical civilizations of Mesoamerica were breaking apart. Teotihuacan, once the largest city in the Americas, had collapsed a few centuries earlier. The Maya in the southern lowlands were entering the crisis that would empty their cities within 100 years. Power was fragmenting, populations were moving, and the religious and political traditions of Mesoamerica were looking for new ground. Then the architectural evidence began to align. At Wupatki, on the western edge of the Chacoan world, archaeologists found a Mesoamerican ball court, of the kind used for ritual games played across the Valley of Mexico for more than 1,000 years. There was no tradition of ball courts anywhere else in the Southwest. It had been imported. Inside Chaco itself, at the great house called Chetro Kettle, a colonnaded facade was built along one of the central walls. Columns arranged in a row along a ceremonial space, exactly matching the architectural style of Mesoamerican temples hundreds of miles to the south. Then came the teeth. In the ceremonial heart of Pueblo Bonito, among the elite burials that had already yielded the dynastic signal, researchers found a single filed tooth, a specific style of dental modification common across Mesoamerica and completely unknown anywhere north of Mexico. None. Not one. And yet there it was in the grave of an elite Chacoan, a signature that could only have been carried north by a person born and raised in Mesoamerica. A picture was assembling itself. A small group from the collapsing Mesoamerican world had traveled north. They had not come as equals. And the template they had brought with them came with something else. For most of the 20th century, one physical anthropologist stood almost alone in trying to explain what the Chacoan bones were actually showing. His name was Christy Turner, and for more than 30 years his colleagues wished he would stop. Turner had trained as a forensic consultant. He had worked with American police investigating homicides. He knew what human bones looked like when they had been treated gently after death, and he knew what they looked like when they had been treated as something else. When he began examining the skeletal collections from Chaco Canyon and the surrounding great houses, he saw a pattern that did not fit the peaceful farmer narrative at all. The bones had been processed, not buried, not cremated, not laid to rest in any way that resembled the ceremonial traditions of the surrounding ancestral Puebloan world. They had been dismembered, broken, burned, and scattered. And the damage on them matched, with disturbing precision, the damage that Turner saw on the bones of animals that had been butchered for food. He spent decades building a forensic checklist. A minimum of 6 criteria had to be present before he would conclude that a skeletal assemblage showed evidence of cannibalism, not violence, not ritual mutilation, actual processing of a human body as food. The first was burning on the backs of skulls, but not on the faces, consistent with the head being placed on a fire while the brain was still intact. The second was anvil abrasion, the distinctive scraping pattern left when a defleshed bone is smashed between 2 stones to extract marrow. The third was cut marks made by stone tools, located at the specific joint endpoints where tendons hold muscle to bone. The fourth was pot polish, a fine abrasive sheen left on bone fragments that had been stirred inside ceramic cooking vessels. The fifth was fracture patterns consistent with breaking fresh bone, not weathered bone. The sixth, most damning of all, was the systematic absence of vertebrae, which are the richest source of marrow in the human body and which had been pulverized in nearly every processed assemblage. Applied to the Chacoan material, the checklist produced a result that the field could not dismiss. Turner and his colleagues identified nearly 300 individuals across dozens of sites whose remains met the full forensic criteria. Men, women, children, infants, processed identically to the way Chacoan hunters processed deer and rabbit. Even then, many researchers argued that processing did not prove consumption. The bones showed butchering. They did not yet show eating. The gap closed in 1997 at a site called Cowboy Wash in southwestern Colorado. Excavators found the remains of 7 individuals processed according to every one of Turner's 6 criteria. And in the hearth at the center of the community, alongside the cooking vessels, they found something else, a coprolite. Desiccated human feces preserved by the dry desert climate, deposited at the scene of the processing. The biochemist Richard Marlar took the coprolite to his laboratory at the University of Colorado and designed a test for a single protein, human myoglobin. Myoglobin is found only in skeletal muscle. It does not exist anywhere else in the human body. It is not present in the intestinal tract of a person who has eaten plants or animals. The only way human myoglobin can appear in human feces is if one human being has consumed the skeletal muscle of another. Marlar ran the test 6 times in triplicate across several weeks with every possible control. Every result came back positive. Cannibalism at Cowboy Wash was no longer a hypothesis. It was a biochemical fact. Once Cowboy Wash was accepted, the broader Chacoan pattern fell into place. Roughly 1 in 50 skeletal remains from the Chacoan world showed the full forensic signature. 90% of the processed remains were found in or near Chacoan ceremonial centers. The signature appeared in the archaeological record almost exactly when Chaco rose, and vanished almost exactly when Chaco fell. The pattern was too specific to be an accident. Not starvation, not warfare. Something organized. The threads came together. A small group had arrived at Chaco from the collapsing Mesoamerican world. They had brought the ball courts and the colonnades and the astronomical alignments, and they had brought the religion that had sustained Mesoamerican elites for centuries. A system in which the universe required blood to function, in which the consumption of human flesh, performed by priests and sanctified by cosmic necessity, was the ultimate expression of power. Transplanted to the Southwest, this model did not need a large population of believers. It needed a small, organized, ruthless elite and a terrorized local population. The Anasazi, in this reading, were not the cannibals, they were the subjects, the victims. The population held in place for nearly 3 centuries by a ruling lineage that had imported a system of religious terror from 1,000 miles away. The forensic record fits this. Entire families processed in a single night, bodies left in ceremonial rooms where everyone in the region would know what had happened and why. The purpose was not food, the purpose was message. Around 1150 AD, the system reached its expiration date. The collapse arrived from several directions at once, and the timing is one of the most precisely documented transitions in North American archaeology. The first signal came from the climate. Tree ring analysis across the Four Corners region, a method that allows researchers to reconstruct rainfall year by year for more than 1,000 years, shows that the warming trend sustaining Chacoan agriculture broke in the middle of the 12th century. Between roughly 1130 AD and 1180 AD, the Southwest entered a prolonged drought. Winters became colder, summers became drier. The rainfall patterns that had allowed Chacoan farmers to grow maize at altitudes that should never have supported it began to fail season after season. Chaco had always been vulnerable to this. The canyon had no reliable water source. The great houses had been sustained by an immense coordinated effort to move food and materials from the outlying regions into the ritual core. When the outlying regions could no longer produce surpluses, the ritual core lost the ability to feed itself. The tribute stopped flowing. The theocratic system contracted. The second signal is visible in the bones. The cannibalism signature, which had been present in the Chacoan archaeological record for more than 200 years, begins to disappear almost exactly when the drought begins. The latest forensic assemblages that meet Turner's full criteria cluster tightly in the decades around 1150 AD. After 1180 AD, they essentially stop appearing in the record. The system that had produced those remains for a quarter of a millennium ceased to produce them at all. Whether the local population rose against the ruling elite, whether the priests lost the religious authority that had sustained the system, or whether the entire coordinated theocracy simply dissolved under the pressure of a failing food supply, the archaeological record cannot say for certain. What it can say is that within a few decades, the great houses were being abandoned. Not destroyed, not burned. Abandoned. The residents walked away and left their homes standing. By 1200 AD, the depopulation of the canyon was well underway. By 1250, the outlying communities were emptying as well. By 1300, the Four Corners region was effectively empty of human habitation. This is the moment that the textbook narrative settles on. The vanishing, the lost civilization, the empty buildings, and this is the moment where that narrative has always been wrong. Because the depopulation of Chaco was not a disappearance. It was a migration. The people who had lived under the Chacoan system moved south and east, following the rivers that still ran. Down to the Rio Grande, the Little Colorado, the mesas, and the fertile valleys, where farming was still possible in a drying climate. What ancient DNA has now done across the last decade is confirm what the oral traditions of the Hopi and the Zuni and the Acoma and the Rio Grande Pueblos had been saying all along. The descendants of the people who built Chaco have been living in plain sight the entire time. The cannibalism at Chaco was not a feature of Puebloan culture. It was a feature of what had been done to Puebloan culture by an imported ruling class that used a borrowed religion to hold power for 2.5 centuries. The Anasazi did not vanish. The system that had been imposed on them did.